Morton County, Dakota Territory, October 1886. The railroad had been in Bismarck 3 years, and milled pine was cheaper than it had ever been. Every homesteader with $1 saved or a relative back east was putting up a frame house. A man who didn't was either broke, backward, or both. Lars Halverson wasn't broke. He had $1,400 in the Bank of Bismarck, money from 3 straight years of good wheat on his claim along the Hart River. He could have ordered a full lumber package from the yard in Mandan, kiln-dried studs, clapboard siding, double-hung windows with real glass, and still had cash left over to furnish the place. His wife Inga had already picked out the curtains she wanted. And then Lars told her he was building the house from dirt. Not a standard sod house, not the kind of 2-foot-thick emergency shelter every homesteader threw up the first autumn and swore they'd replace by spring. Lars Halverson planned to build something nobody in Morton County had ever seen a white man attempt. A house sunk 4 feet into a south-facing slope, with walls of rammed earth and prairie sod stacked 4 feet thick, a roof of timber and soil you could graze a cow on, and a north face that wasn't a wall at all, but a continuation of the hillside itself. It would cost him less than $30 in materials and every ounce of his reputation. The neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. The neighbors, it turned out, were wrong. Lars Halverson was 41 years old, a Norwegian immigrant who'd spent his first American decade farming rocks out of the soil in Fillmore County, Minnesota, before the Dakota boom pulled him west. He was not an architect, he was not an engineer. He was a careful man who noticed things, and what he'd noticed about houses on the northern plains was a quiet, life-and-death truth most people were too busy keeping up appearances to see. His first winter in Dakota, 1883 to 84, he and Inga and their 2 boys had lived in a standard dugout scraped into the bank of the Hart River. It was dark, it was damp in spring. But when the temperature dropped to 30 below that January and stayed there for 10 days, the dugout never fell below 50 degrees. A tiny sheet iron stove burning twisted hay and cottonwood kept them in their shirt sleeves while the wind howled overhead and cattle froze standing up. The earth held heat like an anvil holds heat from a forge. The second winter, a neighbor named Newt Everson invited the Halversons to stay in his brand-new frame house while Newt was away caring for a sick brother in St. Paul. The house was beautiful. White clapboard, a porch, a front room with a real glass window you could watch the sunset through. Inga walked through it the first evening and touched the wallpaper with the tips of her fingers. By 2 in the morning, Lars was feeding split cottonwood into the stove every 40 minutes, and the temperature 3 feet from the hearth was 42 degrees. Cold poured through the walls like water through cheesecloth. The window glass was a sheet of ice you could feel from across the room. Newt Everson owned a modern American house, and his family, had they been in it that January night, would have slept in coats under every blanket they owned. They burned through 2 full cords of wood that month and never got the front room above 48. Lars came home from that winter and told Inga, "A house that looks like a house and acts like a sieve is no house at all." Which is why, in October of 1886, Lars Halverson started digging into the gentle south slope of his claim with a spade and a borrowed Fresno scraper, and a plan he'd been sketching in the back of his ledger for 2 years. He wasn't inventing anything from scratch. During his first year on the Hart River, he'd traded goods at the agency store near Fort Yates and spent time inside the earth lodges of the Arikara and Mandan families who lived along the Missouri. Those lodges were large, timber-framed structures covered in layers of packed earth and grass, some of them 40 feet across. They had stood on the plains for centuries. In winter, they were warm. In summer, they were cool. The people who built them understood what it took settlers decades to learn. On the northern prairie, the earth itself is your best building material. What Lars Halverson decided to build was a European homesteader's synthesis of that ancient idea. A hybrid of the dugout, the earth lodge, and the thick-walled soddy, with dimensions and details calculated by feel and memory, and a stubborn respect for what the land had already taught him. The foundation was a trench dug 4 feet into the hillside, level and square, 20 feet wide and 28 feet deep. The floor sat below the frost line, where the ground temperature stayed a constant 40 to 50 degrees year-round. From that trench, he laid up walls not of framed lumber, but of sod blocks cut 3 feet wide, 18 inches thick, and 2 feet long, lifted from the virgin buffalo grass prairie half a mile away. The blocks were laid grass side down in a running bond, overlapping like bricks. The wall thickness was a full 4 feet at the base, tapering slightly to 3 feet at the top plate, with every seam packed with loose earth and pounded tight with a heavy wooden tamper. The sod itself was dense with roots, and once settled it became a monolithic mass of nearly 300 pounds per running foot. The west wall was the same, the east wall the same. The south wall, facing the sun, was different. Lars set 2 large windows there, salvaged from an abandoned claim shack for $1 apiece. No windows anywhere else. The door was on the south side, a heavy oak slab he'd hauled from St. Paul, set deep in a recessed entry so the wind had to turn 2 corners before it reached the living space. The north wall, the one that would face the full force of a January blizzard screaming down from Canada, was not a wall at all in the conventional sense. Lars set a row of heavy cottonwood posts 8 feet high and stacked sod between them, but the outside was buried completely. He pushed the excavated earth from the foundation against the north face, packing it in lifts and wetting it down until it formed a solid earthen berm 12 feet thick at the base, sloping up to the eaves. By the time he finished, the north side of the house looked like nothing more than a grassy knoll. You could walk over the house without knowing there was a house underneath. The timber roof was cedar poles laid side by side, covered with a layer of oiled canvas, then 18 inches of clay soil, then a final skin of living sod. The ceiling inside was 7 feet at its highest point. The boys, Nels and Peter, could touch it with their fingertips. Total cash outlay, $11 for a used stove, $4 for stovepipe and hardware, $2 for window putty and nails, and a gallon of boiled linseed oil for the door. The earth cost nothing. The sod cost nothing. The labor was his own back and the help of a single hired man for 10 days. From the outside, the house barely looked like human habitation. A stranger riding past would see a grassy mound with 2 small, south-facing windows glinting in the autumn sun and a thin wisp of smoke rising from a stovepipe that stuck out of the hillside like an afterthought. There was no porch, no gable, no painted trim. It did not look like progress. It looked like something a badger would build, and that was exactly what the white settlement of Morton County said about it. The first person to use the word badger hole was a man named Hiram Flagg, who owned the feed store in Mandan and considered himself an authority on everything people ought to be doing with their money. Flagg heard about Halverson's building project from a freighter hauling supplies to Fort Rice. He repeated the term at his counter the next day, and by the end of the week it had spread through every claim shanty and section house within 30 miles. Lars Halverson was building a badger hole. He had cash in the bank and chose to live in a dirt pile. Either he was cheap, or he was crazy, or the Norwegians simply didn't know any better. Knut Everson, whose frame house Lars had frozen in 2 winters earlier, rode out to see the construction for himself in early November. He stood in the brown grass with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the mound for a long time without speaking. "Lars," he said finally, "I know you put stock in what the Indians do, but the Indians are on reservations and we're building a territory here. You've got boys. They're going to grow up and tell people they were raised in a den." "It's warm," Lars said. "It's dirt. It's a dirt den with windows." "We'll know in January." "In January, you're going to wish you'd framed it," Knut said, and he wasn't being cruel. He genuinely believed it. Every instinct his culture had given him said that a proper house was made of cut lumber, that dirt was for animals, that a civilized man showed his worth by rising above the ground, not burrowing into it. He rode away, shaking his head. At the Lutheran Church social in Mandan 2 weeks later, Inga Halverson heard the talk directly. The women's circle was polite, but the politeness had a serrated edge. Somebody said it was a shame with the money they had. Somebody else said Inga must be a saint to put up with it. Inga came home and sat at the table Lars had built from a packing crate and looked at the two small windows and the packed earth floor and the thick walls that made the room feel like the inside of a great cupped hand. "Lars," she said, "I believe you, but believing you and having everyone think we've fallen back into the dark ages are two different things." He nodded. He knew Inga was carrying the heavier burden. Lars Halverson could shrug off gossip like rainwater. Inga had to live in the community. "If it doesn't work," he said, "I'll frame us a house in the spring. 2 stories, big windows, I promise." The winter of 1886 to 87 was not an ordinary winter. It was the winter that broke the open-range cattle industry on the northern plains, the winter of the Great Blizzard of January 1887. The winter when temperatures in Central Dakota Territory dropped to 46 degrees below zero and stayed below zero for 2 weeks without interruption. Livestock died by the tens of thousands. Stage lines stopped running. The Missouri River froze solid enough to drive a freight wagon across. Families in frame houses from Bismarck to the Black Hills woke each morning to find their breath frozen on the blankets above their faces and their water buckets solid ice beside the stove. Hiram Flagg, the feed store man who'd coined Badger Hole, owned a fine 2-story frame house on the main street of Mandan. It was the best-built house in town, with double-hung windows, plaster lath, and a pot-bellied stove in every downstairs room. By the second week of January, with the outside temperature at 40 below, Flagg's family was huddled in the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, at 47 degrees. The stoves were running wide open, the stovepipe glowed dull red in the ceiling, and he was burning through a cord of split cottonwood every 10 days. He still couldn't bring the house above 50. Newt Everson burned a cord and a half in the first 3 weeks of January, and his family wore their coats at the supper table. His wife Greta stuffed rags into the gaps around the window frames, and the wind still found its way through. The pine-clabbered walls conducted cold straight into the room. A standard uninsulated frame wall of the era, 3/4 of an inch of plaster, 4 inches of empty stud cavity, and pine sheathing, has an R value of roughly 4. It resists heat flow about as effectively as a single pane of glass. Whatever warmth the stove put out passed through the walls and vanished into the Dakota night within minutes. Those frame houses did exactly what the physics said they would do. They lost heat fast, and they stored nothing. Inside the Halverson Mound on the Heart River, the story was different. On the morning of January 12, 1887, the temperature at the Fort Yates weather station registered 43 below zero. The wind was out of the northwest at 30 miles an hour, driving the wind chill to something beyond what any human being should have to calculate. Newt Everson, whose own house was at 41 degrees and falling, decided to ride the 4 miles to the Halverson place. He told himself he was checking on them. In truth, he needed to know. The ride nearly killed his horse. By the time Newt reached the south face of the Halverson claim and saw the 2 small windows glowing faintly in the frozen blue dark, his beard was a mask of ice and his hands were too numb to grip the reins properly. Lars opened the door, the heavy oak door set into that recessed entry, and a wave of warm air spilled out into the 40 below morning. The kind of warm air that fogged instantly in the cold. The kind of warm air a man could lean into. Newt stepped inside and stopped. Inga was at the stove, frying salt pork in a cast-iron skillet, wearing a cotton dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. Nels and Peter, the boys, were on the floor doing their lessons in wool shirts, not a coat between them. The thermometer Lars had tacked to the wall beside the door read 67 degrees. Newt stared at it. He looked at the stove. The stove was burning, but it was not roaring. It was a steady, modest fire, the damper half closed, a few chunks of cottonwood glowing red on the grate. Lars had not been feeding it all night. He had banked it at bedtime, the way you bank any stove, and gone to sleep. The house was holding 67 degrees 16 hours after the fire had been reduced to embers. "How?" Newt said. Lars put his hand flat on the interior wall. "Feel this." Newt pressed his palm against the packed earth and sod. It was warm, not room temperature warm, actively warm, like a stone that had been sitting in the sun all afternoon. 4 feet of compacted earth had absorbed heat from the stove over days and weeks and was now radiating it back into the room in a slow, continuous pulse. The north wall, backed by 12 feet of bermed earth, and the hillside itself, wasn't fighting the cold at all. It simply wasn't participating. The cold couldn't get through. Whatever temperature the ground held at that depth, somewhere in the high 40s, even in January, stayed right where it was, and the interior of the house floated above it like a bubble of warmth sealed by mass. Lars Halvorsen had not needed to study thermodynamics. He'd felt the right answer in the walls of an Arikara lodge, and in the frozen misery of a frame house, and in the ancient, untaught understanding that dense, heavy things hold heat and light, empty things let it go. What he had built was a thermal battery. The walls weighed close to 90,000 pounds. That mass soaked up the stove's output during the day, lagged the release by 8 to 12 hours, and radiated it back through the night when the fire had died. The low ceiling, 7 feet instead of the 9 or 10 that were fashionable in frame houses, kept the heated air in the occupied zone rather than letting it rise into wasted space. The south-facing windows caught the low winter sun, which heated the packed earth floor directly, and the floor stored that solar gain the same way the walls stored the stove heat. The hillside and the berm cut the wind load to 0 on the north, west, and east faces. The house didn't feel the wind. It didn't know there was a wind. Newt Everson stood there in his frozen coat with his hand on a warm dirt wall and did the arithmetic in his head. He had burned 1.5 quarts of cottonwood in 3 weeks. Lars was burning 1/2 quart a month, and his house was 20 degrees warmer. "I was wrong," Newt said. He said it plainly, without defensiveness. "You knew something I didn't." Word traveled. It traveled fast, and it traveled on the same cold wind that had made frame house families miserable for 6 weeks. By late January, men were riding out to the Halvorsen place just to stand inside and feel the walls. Some of them brought thermometers, some brought notebooks. A homesteader named Jorgen Dahl, who'd lost 7 head of cattle to the cold and nearly lost his wife to the despair of living in a house that wouldn't warm, came inside, felt the wall, and wept. Hiram Flagg never visited. He was a proud man, and he wouldn't give Halvorsen the satisfaction. But the following autumn, Flagg's hired hand spent 2 weeks digging out the north wall of Flagg's frame house and packing earth against it to the windowsills. Nobody said anything. The year after that, a 2-foot thickness went on. Flagg called it an insulation berm and claimed he'd thought of it himself. Nobody in Mandan believed him, but nobody said so to his face. The carpenter who made the most complete conversion was a man named Clarence Decker, who had built 17 frame houses across Morton County and considered himself the territory's finest builder. In March of 1887, Decker showed up at the Halvorsen place with a measuring tape, a level, and a list of questions that took 3 hours to answer. He measured wall thickness, ceiling height, window placement, berm slope, floor depth, and roof composition. He dug a test hole against the north berm to see how the earth was packed. He took soil samples. Then he went home and drew up plans for what he called a Dakota thermal house, an earth-bermed frame structure with a super-insulated north wall, south-facing windows, and a heavy-mass stove inside. He built 6 of them over the next 5 years. He never gave Lars Halvorsen a dime in credit, but the plans survived, and if you look at passive solar house designs from the 1970s, you'll see Clarence Decker's fingerprints all over them. And behind his fingerprints, the shape of an Arikara earth lodge, and behind that, what a wheat farmer figured out by paying attention. Lars and Inga Halvorsen lived in their dirt house for 22 years. They raised 2 sons there, saw both of them go off to the agricultural college in Fargo, and eventually followed them to a smaller place in town when age made the homestead too much work. The house never leaked. The walls never cracked. The roof grew a thick mat of grama and buffalo grass that held the soil in place through everything the Dakota weather threw at it. After they left, the house stood empty for a decade, then gradually slumped back into the hillside from which it had been carved. By the county road crew widened the section line in 1922, there was nothing visible but a faint depression in the prairie and a couple of cedar posts rotting in the sun. The earth had taken the house back, quietly and without complaint, the way the earth takes everything back eventually. But for those 22 winters, Lars Halverson's family was warm. Not just warm, comfortable. While their neighbors in their bright, modern frame houses shivered and burned wood by the wagon load and worried about their children's fingers turning blue in the night, the Halversons slept under light quilts and woke to 65 degrees and a stove that had not been fed since midnight. The house worked because it respected the physics of the ground beneath it. It worked because Lars Halverson had looked at the materials everyone else was throwing away, dirt, grass, the south-facing slope of a hill, and seen not poverty, but principle. He was not an engineer, he was not a visionary, he was a man who paid attention to what kept his family alive, and he trusted what he'd felt with his own two hands, more than what the feed store crowd said a house was supposed to look like. Sometimes the wisest building on the prairie is the one that looks like a hill. And if you've ever lived through a winter that made you question your siding, your heating bill, or your life choices, you already understand why a 4-foot wall of dirt can outperform a 2x4 any day of the week. Mass is memory. The earth remembers the sun, and it remembers the fire, and it gives the heat back all night long. That is not primitive, that is physics. And the people everyone thought were crazy knew it first. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Hit that subscribe button for one frontier technique that still works every week. And hit the like button if this story changed how you think about what a house is actually supposed to do, because the smartest answers are sometimes buried right under your feet.